Okay, good morning. We're in Hemshech Tzadik Daled, page 163. And after a relatively long example of the Koyach HaTenua, the power of movement, to explain what? To explain the difference between the level of Yachid and Echad, where one is a unity that's made of parts and uniting different components. So there's a distinction of levels, and then they become united. And Yachid, which is Yachid Be'etzem, means it really is beyond any details. In any actual way. We're going to explain what Esser Spheres Sagnuzas, the 10 hidden spheres, are like before the Tzimtzum. Of the Eiris, how it's encompassed in its source. That's the bottom line now. How it's encompassed in the source, which she began discussing to explain this third level of bittul in Eir, which is a bittul called Efes Bil Techa, or Efes Bilode. Nothing Bilode without him. So it reflects, even though there's a mitzias, like he said, there's no such thing as bittul if there's no mitzias, but there's no mitzias that's apparent. All it is atzmus, expression. This is what we're learning right now. So the example that he gave, and to sum up the example, and then we'll continue on, was essentially explaining how faculties, human faculties or all faculties, from a state of beyond any definition and any shape and form, which he calls the Koyach Hiyuli, which Mushal Makola Giluim Sheboim Menu. It's a potential state within the core power of that particular faculty. In this case, we're talking about Tenua. So it's the fact that the Adam Misnane is a movable entity, means it's defined by movement. We're not talking about actual movement or not actual. Everything originates from there. That it's defined. A stone, for example, you don't say is called Even Misnaneh or called Dema Misnaneh. You don't say that. It's not the property of a stone, it's to be movable. It's to be mobile. Now, in that itself, that evolves what he called, which is general movement, and he divided it into three. The movement of everything related to the head, movement everything between squinting the eye and furrowing the brow and moving your lip, types of movements completely. And within each of them, there's details. Same thing with the arms, with the hands. Whether a person is, what do you call the different things with their hands? Lifting something, drawing something, is a bunch of different type of movements necessary. And in writing itself, the difference between writing from hiyuli to kloli proti, still kloli, and prote protim basically. Once you actually do the movement, then we're dealing with real detail. Even when you're actualizing a movement, there's always more that you're not necessarily fully investing. Returns, so to speak, after you rest, after the movement has ended, whether the walking, the writing, or whatever, it all returns back klali prati and back to the, does he say hiyuli? He doesn't say hiyuli. That's where it becomes echad. So in other words, in a way, even though it's not physical, these faculties in that sense, but in a way it's emerging out of, it would be. So the koyach klali prati is more like the state of the capacity to move, let's say to write. You're investing it into something outside of you in that movement, or same thing with walking. But when you stop that movement, it goes back to the koyach klali prati, the power to move, the ability to move. That he calls echad because it's to the klal from the prat, from the detailed specific movement. Yochid, on the other hand, is miyuchid be'etzem. There's no klal of prat. He says that is kumay koyach. That's like before you began to actually move. Kumay koyach hatnu aprati koydem shepoel va'isa shu miyuchid be'koyach hatnu haklali. That is calling yochid, meaning before it was actualized in a specific movement. Then the next section, which we learned yesterday, says that even though the koyach hatnu, you could say, is different, is the lowest of all faculties. So in a sense, why are you calling it yochid be'etzem? Koyach hatnu is very different than koyach haseichel. Seichel, as he explained, is a whole higher, some more sublime entity. So he compared it to the difference between the head and the heel. That even though there's a big difference between the head and the heel, and even the very physical flesh of the brain is different than the flesh of the heel, yet there's something that equalizes them, that the nefesh life, the very life force is equal in the entire body, from head to toe. He says, same thing in Evrei HaNefesh, that even though on one hand, it's true the tenua, movement, is far inferior, so to speak, or lower than using your seichel, to the point that seichel requires yigiyah, effort. Tenua doesn't require any effort. Just say, I want to start moving, I move. Why? Because it's a koyach that's very close to the surface, so to speak. Seichel is embedded and deeper in, so you need strain, you need exertion, to the point of exertion like you compared it to the Flintstone. So even though there's that difference, like the difference in the head and the heel, and yet in the body, in the Evrei Haguf, and yet there's something that's equal. They're both koyches hanefesh. They're both ruchnim. So in that sense, you can use koyach hatenu as an example of the koyach hatenu, the way it's within the koyach before it actualizes, even though it's called close to the surface, like he said by tenua, koyach achab. He says, what did he say? Korev. I want to see the lashon. So Amid umuchen lifel. It's ready. It's Amid. It's basically ready to activate. It doesn't need tremendous effort. He says, nevertheless, avlim zeh koyach ruchni shegam hapratim miyuchodim ba'klal b'yichud gamur. That the pratim, meaning all the specific types of movement, are all encompassed in a yichud gamur, which definitely means yochid here, that is beyond details, even though it is a so-called more lower form of faculty, but it's still that faculty. That's where we stopped in the middle of page 163. What I was pointing out yesterday, and I really want to wait till we finish, but I'll say it anyway because it's just so glaring in a way. It seems to me that what he's saying here, using this example, is a way of understanding the same thing, Lamaila, how God creates existence. So if you call God the artist, the cosmic artist, so art, as we said, siyur, is one of the keiches, keich hatnua. So in a sense, before God created the world, there was no movement. There was no need for movement. Then the Eibishter decided he wants to create a world, so this begins the process of some movement. The movement, even on a conceptual level, the movement from before he wants it to wanting it. Obviously, conceptually, because we're not talking about in time. We spoke, lifnei sha'ol seine, lifnei kedem alei saratzim. Then comes the desire. What happens? We talked about first the consideration, and then the deliberation, shakavitaria, and then hachlota, which is the determination. And then begins the process of what does he want in this art? Let's call it a house. The desire for a house. So we know there's a desire embedded in each one of us. It could be years before you become even aware of it. Then you become aware, and it could still be years before you act on it. Like we spoke, the Ratzon Haklali, the Ratzon Haprati. But then comes the process where you begin moving toward it. Merutza. Remember Ratzon, Melosh, and Merutza. Move toward it. And this is all still in Ratzon, which isn't even Tenua, because you're not actually building the house yet. But then comes a point after the Tzimtzum, with the Tzimtzum and after the Tzimtzum, that it actually becomes a creation. It says, Aseis, Eibishter is creating heaven and earth. Creation is a process. It's The Kavyachol, it's similar to when we build something. So it's a form of a tenuah, it's a form of a movement, which is perhaps why he's using that example, because by the Eibishter, we know his keiches, so to speak, are much higher than tenuah. We're not talking about the seichel amidus, the divine seichel amidus. We're talking about the action, the creation process of building something. So on one hand, it's a faculty, so to speak, like we know, lav urche de malke. Expression is talking about milan de hedyeta, that it's not the natural nature of the king is not to speak simple. Right. Lav urche de malke lishtoi b'milan de hedyeta. That's not the urche is the path, the way, the method of the king. It's not the king. That's why so when the Eibishter is creating heaven and earth in the 6 days, we call it a yerida. What means a yerida? That it's going down to a level, because it's not a lakus as it is in his natural state. Vayechul hashamayim, Shabbos is an aliyah back, also not mamish into atzmus, but basically, relatively speaking. So in a way, you could say creation is God's tenuah. So there's two ways to understand achdus Hashem. You look at the details, Mamata Lamailo, we look at the details of the world, and we're miyachid Shmei Yisbarach. That's called Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. We learned it earlier about Su'u Moreh Meinechem. We contemplate. What do we contemplate on? Ma Godlu Masach Hashem, Ma Godlu Masach Hashem, Tzva Ha'aretz, Tzva Hashemayim. So he said, with Tzva Ha'aretz, you come to Achdus. You come to realize that God is coordinating all of this, and there's a unifying force, but it's an Achdus from the details. We're not talking about how Atzmus, how Eibishter is on his own. We're talking about, even in the world that seems so fragmented and diversified, there is an Achdus, a multitude. In the Ribui, Marabu, you see an Achdus in it. Hashem Echad, like we said, Echad, Aleph, Ches, Dalet. So that's a contemplation that you come to. You could say it's the second level of Bittul a little, because there is an existence and you're miyachid. I don't know if the second level, I may be wrong with that. Okay, that's echad. That means the tenuah happened. God created a world. The movement happened. Just like we write Ayin Beis, the Eibishter said, Basarim Amoris Nivra Elam. He said, Akimas Vosav Hava Maisa. The Eibishter uttered the words, Yehi Yo'er, Yehi Rakia, etc. So, and then it goes back, like on Shabbos, he says, Noch. Shabbos, it goes back. The pratim go back so-called in their source, and you sense the achdus. Now, the truth is, throughout the week, we can experience it. But on Shabbos, it's on a higher level. I'm just explaining it, my own aces here. Yochid is not talking about the achdus connected to the details. It's talking about the achdus before there were details. How did God see the world? If you look at the Eibishter looking at the world, that's the Esesphiris Hagnuzis. There's no world yet. It didn't happen yet, the tenuah. There was no actualization. It was God envisioning the creator, the artist, the engineer, whatever you want to call him, envisioning what he wants. There it's Yochid Be'etzem. There, yes, the details are not details yet. They're all one picture that he wants. He wants a tachteinim. He wants a world. And there it's in a state of Yochid, which would make the moshel absolutely, actually a very good, excellent mashal. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't spell this out yet. It seems to me that is the place that he's going to, and let's see what he's going to say now. Actually, in the Panim, we'll learn. The page is page 163. The line begins Gamur, and we're starting from V'hadugma Mizeh. Okay. V'hadugma Mizeh Yuvan. The example from this that we just spoke about, the Koyach HaTenuah, the power of movement. And we spoke about it as it comes into details, and then how the detail returns back, so to speak, to its source, where it's echad, or before it even came into details, as it's in the koyach kloli. So he says, the dugma from this, we're now going to apply, Yuvan Lamaila will understand how it is Lamaila, by the way the Eibishter created the world. Be'eser Sfiris Hagnuzis. So he's going back to the bottom. We began this whole thing, the discussion was the bottom of page 161, 2 pages back, about the 10 hidden spheres. I should read. The 10 hidden spheres that are hidden b'maitzilon in the emanator. In the emanator of these spheres. Shem klulim ba'atzmus hamaitzel baruch hu. These 10 spheres are encompassed in Atzmus Hamaitzel Baruch Hu, in the core essence of the emanator, may he be blessed. B'bchinas yichud bli shum mitzias la'atzman klal. The way they're encompassed there is in a state of unity without any mitzias la'atzman. There's no existence of them yet. What does that mean? That means if an artist envisions the art he's going to create, so there's no mitzias yet of art, there's no mitzias of details. He's actually envisioning the full picture. And the full picture is more, what dominates there is the cohesive and seamless picture as one entity. Then you break it into details. When you want to build a home, and that home has you have a certain vision for your home. In the vision, it's not the detail of this room or that room, it's the vision of the entire home. Yes, when you need to implement it and execute it, you're going to have to break it down in details. That's why I brought about the Ratzon before, because we learned earlier this idea, that before the Ratzon before is just, I want a home. Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu liyas leidira b'tachtein. Or v'asi the migdash v'shachanti b'seicham. The focus is v'shachanti b'seicham. Then he says, okay, now how? Take Kesef, Zov, and Necheshes, and all the 15 things that they gathered, that they donated, build Osuli Oren, make an ark, Meneda, Mizbeach, etc., etc. The Yiriyas, the walls. So the first thing is the vision. In the vision, you call it a Yichud, again, Blishu Metzias La'atzmon Klal. Interesting diuk, La'atzmon. He doesn't say nothing exists. Obviously, it's a vision of something, but there's no independent entity here. So once you start building it, so then you bring the contractors and you bring the electricians and the bricklayers and the plumbers. So now there's a metzias. They're all building according to the vision, but you have now an existing detail. Or when the artist starts painting, he's actually using the color red and the color blue, and he's using different paintbrushes and easels and a canvas. Everything comes down to details. Truth is, those details are meant to be aligned with obviously the yachid, the yichud, but now it's already gotten into actual, like he said, the tnua. When you actually move, there's an actual movement. You're writing an aleph. Yes, it's true that power of movement comes from the koyach klali prati of movement in writing in general, and in your hand more in general, and in your entire body, all the way back to the koyach yuli. The fact that you're a moving entity, you're alive, and therefore kol chaim is naneya. But there's a specific detail. So if you really analyze the mashal now, in this context, you really get a really interesting way of understanding what Esesfiris Agnuzis are, because they are still in that state. Most likely, Esesfiris Agnuzis is like the koyach yuli in the nimshal, in the mashal. But I'm not positive, he didn't say it explicitly. Most likely that's what it is, because that would be the yachid level. Once it's klali prati, like a head, a body, and legs, it's probably more, has already some klali prati, even though, relatively speaking, it's also a united state. But that's already breaking into details. We don't have to go there right now. So that's for the level of Esesfiris Agnuzis, Yichud, as he says, She'ein lehem. Remember, he brought at the bottom, or actually the top, the bottom of page 161, he said, I think he said, yeah, Antu Chad. One word of Yichud here is not Echad, but Yichud. Yochid be'et. So now he says, Zeu Antu Chad, Pirush. I'm sorry. V'zeu Antu Chad b'chinis Yochid. The state of Yochid, like we said, Yochid is a unity be'etzem, not one that relates to details. He said on the top, it's there's no klalat stage. Yochid. V'loi b'chushban. Loshen Antu Chad v'chushban Yudiyah. That's what he says. You're one, and not a one that is a measurable one. Like when you say there's one, as opposed to two. So there you're talking already in the world of structure of numbers. So it's one and not two. That's also Hashem Echad. He's not, there's one and not Chaz V'Shalom two. But Yachid is Lei B'Chushban. It's not part of the numerical. It's a separate entity altogether. Lei B'Chushban, not measurable, not countable. Ta'gam Shehim Eser Spheres, but we just said there are 10 spheres. 10 is 10. 10 is not one. Makom Mokim Einam B'Chushban Eser. They're not countable 10. In other words, they're basically a conceptual 10 details that will emerge from this vision. That's how it's usually explained. I don't know if he says it explicitly here. I'll explain this in a minute. Let me just read it. Because due to the fact that they're nullified and united, in other words, it's not 10 functional spheres, Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gevura, but they're all encompassed within the source. The Gam Heim, that's number one. Additionally, the Gam Heim b'bchinas Agdus Mamash Zeim Zeh. So number one, they're encompassed in the source. Secondly, additionally, they're also united completely as one, not as separate faculties or separate attributes. There you can't say on the level of the 10 hidden spheres, a cheshbon, a count, a structure, a measure of 10 spheres. Okay, let me explain what this means. Because then why do you call them Eser Spheres Agnuzis, of course? Then he should have just said Spheres HaNechlolim or Sphira even. But he calls them Eser Spheres Agnuzis. So the focus have to be is on the word Gnuzis. And remember, there's expression in Kabbalah, Chassidus, L'shachech ha'ezen. There's sometimes words are used in order for us to simply be able to understand what we're talking about. I remember once in Yud Aleph Nissen bracha, the Rebbe would give a bracha. The Chassidim would go every birthday of the Rebbe by the Rebbe's door, Gan Eden HaTachten, and give the Rebbe a bracha. They read a pan kloli for the Rebbe's birthday, and the Rebbe would respond with a bracha. And he would edit over the years. It used to be short, and then it became a much longer bracha. So once the Rebbe spoke that Yud Aleph, Yud is the structure of 10 spheres. The structure, 10 Maimoris, Aseres Adibris. Nisper HaShalom is the word that Evan Ezra uses. That 10 is a round number that includes the whole structure of existence. What's Yud Aleph? Yud Aleph is beyond. It's like L'mayla Bligvul. So the Rebbe said, but then why is it Yud Aleph? 11 means 10 plus 1. At the end of the day, so the Rebbe said, so there's no other way to call Bligvul. So we call it Yud Aleph, meaning it's outside of the Yud. So there's 11 as a number 11. There are things that are number 11. Then the 11 is just a so-called way, the only way we can describe it. Similar said about Shvi and Shmini, that Shmini is Shemeres HaHekef. In other words, there are times we use a number and we don't mean the number, we mean it's outside, it's like almost Yedias Hashlila. We can't say it's 10, so we say it's beyond 10, 11. So the point I'm making here is that's not number one we have to keep in mind. Number two, think of it this way. I'm going to give an example. It's an example we've learned even. When you're, before you give a speech, let's say, you're going to make a presentation, you're giving a shir, a class like I'm doing right now, or even in writing, you write up a paper. So we all know it doesn't begin with that. It begins with machshava. You plan it, you research it, you think it through, and in your mind, you have the whole idea. In your mind, it's not divided into paragraphs or sentences or words or letters. Yes, you can envision the letters and words, but if you go all the way into the deepest part of your machshava, even though we know there's always oisius, but there's a level where the oir of the idea, the concept of the idea is dominant, and you don't even recognize there's letters. I always give the example when you read a sefer or a book and you're completely immersed, completely. What is the immersion? To the point you don't even know you're turning pages. I don't know if you've ever been in that place. You're reading a book, the drama, the geschmack, you just feel like you're living it. You definitely don't feel you're reading lines and words. In other words, even though there are words and letters there, what you're experiencing is the author's spirit. It's like hearing a niggin. you're hearing a niggin that transports you to another time and place. You're not focusing on the exact musical notes unless you want to. If you want to focus, how did you sing that niggin? Let me see the notes. Let me see the beat and so on. But when you're experiencing the pure hergish of it, the pure passion, the pure sentiment, you're not even thinking about the details. Why? Because you're connected then to the core essence of of whatever is being conveyed, the story, and you're not focused on at all the details. Now this is a moshel kemuvan. In essence, Firas Agnuzis is the same idea, but it's not after the fact. When we sing a niggin, obviously the niggin is made up of parts. But think the other way around. The person who composed the song, like the person who wrote the paper or delivered a shir, in their mind, before they break it into details, what consumes them is the unified message they want to convey. I want to give over to you that Ayin Beis is the focus is on interface. Then we'll talk the details how that's explained. So when the Eibishter created the world, Kemuvan, as I always say, Kol Yochel could do whatever he wants. But he wanted it to be in a way that we can relate to, so we can connect with him. So he created it in a way and then created us as a mirror image, Salmeinu Kidmusenu, that we too, the way we function reflects how the Eibishter functions. That he wanted also to create in that fashion, that first he envisions existence. If there were no Esesphiras Agnuzis, it would be a leap from Ratzon Oliver Etzene. He wants existence, but he wouldn't have in his own vision what is the so-called the structure of this existence. So the first thing he envisions it, but the envisioning does not focus on the structure. So in Inyan, it's Esesphiras because it's envisioning what the Esesphiras are ultimately going to be. But the state of being they are, Lifnei Tzimtzum, is like in the deepest machshava, where you're completely focused on the unifying element, that they're all encompassed in that unifying vision, and they themselves don't even feel a distinction from one another. They're echad. He said, what's the words he used? Gamzeh, achdus mamish zeim zeh. Because Chachma and Bina are not functional. We're not talking about what distinguishes Chachma from Bina. Right now, it's Chachma, Bina, Das, and everything as one picture that all of them together build. In other words, the vision wants Chachma, Bina, Das, but it's not Chachma, Bina, Das yet until the Tzimtzum, which will conceal that intensity and be able to then actualize it, whether in speech, in words, or in action. So Asara Mamoris Nivra Elam can't happen Lifnei Tzimtzum, because that's already God speaking. Yehi Rakia. But if you're talking about what precedes Yehi Rakia is how God's envisioning all these things. So that's that's essentially how we would explain us as Sagnuzis. So the Eiris are klulim b'mkeiram, or like the Keyach HaTanuah, the way it's encompassed before there's actual movement. Now, I mentioned in the previous classes that this isn't the first time Esesphiras Agnuzis is explained in Ayin Beis. The truth is, this is not Ayin Beis, this is Tzadik Daled, but this idea, we learned it a lot in the beginning of volume 1. As I mentioned, the Prakim, the 20s and 30s, he talks a lot about, or even earlier, I think 15, 16, he starts talking about the 10 hidden spheres and asks all these questions. What does it mean? 10, what are they mitzias? Are they not mitzias? Bottom line, they're not mitzias of spheres. They're pshitus. But in pshitus, how the pshitus, so-called the uniform, unifying vision of God, is envisioning the details that will come. So there's more to say, but I think it suffices for here. This is the first level of Oyer Kol Be'etzem, and I think, as I said at the outset, once we hear the nimshal, the moral, it helps us understand what the mashal was coming to tell us, because the mashal was quite abstract. But I think now that you connect the two, you see where it's going here. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe does not spell it out, but I think once you put the 2 and 2 together, it's pretty clear that it's more or less what I said now. So before I continue, we're going to go now to level 2 in Oyer. So if anybody has any questions or comments, this is the time. And if it's not, it's a good sign. It means I must have explained it adequately. Okay.
But that means that this is the Oichan Aleph is Yochid.
Yeah. Yeah, that's clear. Which would seem to imply, we'll say it later, that the highest level of bittul, where oir is bottled to the point that the only thing is mitzias atzmus, on its highest level will be something of this level. Yeah. But we'll wait. He's going to say that befedish later. And of course, you could say then probably Madrega Beis would probably be Echad, but let's read it. So Madrega HaBeis. Now, what's he referring to? Let me just give you the connection. If you remember the bottom of page 161, he said there are three. He said, Bir Inyan, you do it. Yes, Gimel Madregas Be'edis. We did Madrega HaAleph, and I was going to do 2 and 3, all in this, the end of this paragraph. So what's a Madrega HaBeis? We established Eir Kolol B'mkeirei. Esesfis Agnuzis Yachid is level 1. What's level 2? Madrega HaBeis Be'edis. The second level in the Eidus, who hamshachas v'izgalus ha'eidus la'achar hatzimtzum. Okay, very clear. This is all lifnei hatzimtzum. Now, what? Excuse me? V'amadrega habeis be'eidus hu hamshachas v'izgalus ha'eidus la'achar hatzimtzum. This is now the transmission and the revelation of the lights, of the energies, after the tzimtzum. It's interesting that he's using the word oiris. I want to just stop on that a moment. Sometimes he says oir, because I think because he wants to demonstrate that we're talking now the oiris that will become part of Ishtalshalus, and there's going to be oir ha'chochmeh, oir ha'bina, oir ha'das, and so on, oir ha'chesed. So he wants to connect details. So even though Lifnei Tzimtzum is talking not details, because it's all a yachid, but as it emerges, it's going to ultimately be not just one eir, it's going to be a number of eirs. So of course, Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum Eir is Yosher Yachid. Why? Because it's one energy that God emits, but that energy will then split into different forms, all still Eir. Okay, so this is the Acharat Tzimtzum. So now we're already talking about the Tzimtzum is concealing and therefore in some ways channeling this oir. So he continues and says like this: Shehein hafroshes ha'ora me'eir ein sof ha'maitzil b'bchinas sfires proties. So he calls, now this is a hafrosha. Interesting word. Hafrosha means obviously to separate, but when we say hafrosha, does not mean havdalah. It doesn't mean you're cutting. It's not like cutting off a piece of a bread from a loaf of bread. You're talking hafrosha is like hatzola. It's still the original light, but it's now being so-called shaped and defined through the tzimtzum into what he says very clearly from the Eir Ein Sof HaMaitzil, which the first level was encompassed in the vision of the Maitzil. Now it's already come to levels called spheres pratis, specific spheres. Now remember, we're not yet talking about Eiris and Kalim. That will be level 3. We're talking, let's go back to the Moshel. The Koyach HaTanua is not just general movement, that you are a moving entity, or even that your head can move and your arms can move. That's a klolisdika thing. Now we're talking that the movement is beginning to take on shape. There's a reish, guf, regel. In other words, it's beginning to take on forms, this eir, that each one is going to have its unique properties using that muscle. Or in the case of Lamaila, that the artist has, after the vision, now comes, he starts getting closer to structuring it. So now comes how envisioning this, or more than envisioning, beginning to lay out the structure of what he wants, of what that vision in the first level wanted. So now he says like this: Hafrosh pratis, the kol sphere
is not Hatzolah. Hafrosh is a lower level, because this is the sphere of the Oya base. Hatzolah is completely closer to Yochid. Hafrosh means that he is like separating, but not complete.
Okay. I'm fine with that. Sometimes Hatzolah and Hafrosh are used together. Here, yes, you could say level 1, because he did say Natzolim, because usually Atzilus the Klolus is Lifnei Tzimtzum, but regardless, fine, Hafrasha, but it's still not separate completely. So he says the Chol Sfira is Sfira. And remember, Sfira, what does the word Sfira mean? Remember, we learned in volume 1 3 meanings. Sfira from the word number, from the word Sipur, Mispar, the word Sipur, story, and the third Sapir, transparency, the sapphire. We also learned from the word Sefer. Being Sfira is basically just, is essentially God's instruments for creation. Is the DNA and the building blocks of existence, but as the creator is using them, is using the building blocks. So the Spheres really are God's expression. In Lifnei Tzimtzum, in level 1, as we said, it's all encompassed in that one vision. Now, every sphere, kol sphere, yesh lo kiyuma. See, now he's talking the word kiyum, not mitzias. Remember, mitzias, kiyum, gila are also these 3 levels. Yesh lo kiyuma, v'inyono la'atzma b'mitzias nikeres. Every sphere has its own particular kiyum, mean its particular perpetuation. Kiyum is not perpetuation. It's particular sustenance. I don't want to say function because that's not the word kiyum here. I would say it's particular status even, or particular importance or significance, v'inyono la'atzma, for itself, not as it's connected to the others, b'mitzias nikeres, in a discernible existence. Mamish different than level 1. Level 1, there's no mitzias nikeres. Now, something has emerged. Chochmah, Bina. It's still not a full-bodied functional entity, but level 2 is it's now turned, we now have some form of distinction of the spheres. If you want an example, I always use another example as the fetus. Upon conception, it's one cell. Everything is concentrated in an intense way in that one cell. What happens after the cell splits and then splits again and again? So after a while, let's say after the first trimester, you can actually see the beginning of the budding of a fetus, the beginning of the shape and form. First the head, you go further along pregnancy and you see how it develops, and it's mamish a muscle for this. It's excellent muscle. It was all concentrated in that one cell, nothing was distinguishable. It was one thing that basically this child, all in one cell. Then, obviously, it's a muscle gashmi, and in Esesphiris, it's not gashmis. Then it begins to, you start seeing, like he says exactly these words, mitzias nikeres. Each part, each one of the 10 spheres, svira, v'inyan la'atzma b'mitzias nikeres. Ve'ena dema lemadrega ha'alef. And it's not similar to the first level. The ima yeson esesphiris, even though the first level we also called esesphiris, but avalei b'chushban canal. But they were not countable spheres. They were conceptual and all part of that one vision. They're not lei b'chushban. Ve'enon elarak mitzias bilvad. So the Rebbe corrects that you have to say, he says, ulai utos hamaytik v'tzarech liyas amitzias achas bilvad, because it doesn't make sense. Level 1 is not a mitzias. So you have to say the mitzias achas, and the Rebbe refers to Teira Eir. I'm reading the footnote on the bottom, where he uses the word dover echad mamish, and v're'ei lekama reish perek lamed gimel shesham tzarech liyas mitzias bilvad. Let me say reish perek lamed gimel.
Here is mitzias achas, but in perek lamed gimel is a mitzias.
I don't understand. The Rebbe says v're'ei lekama reish perek lamed gimel. Oh, right here. Okay. Ein an ela mitzias bilvad. Okay, yeah. It's a deeper order than it looks, because soon we're going to learn that the 3 levels, the first one is called Mitzias, the second one Kiyum, the third one Gilui. So the Rebbe is saying that even though it seems it should be Mitzias Achas, but the Rebbe is qualifying his own footnote. because it could be the Frierdiker Rebbe is referring, Mitzias Bilvad means it's not yet Kiyum. It only exists. That's all. He doesn't mean Mitzias as a specific existence. That the only thing you could say about the first level of air that it exists. But it's all as one. Second level is Kiyum, it's beginning to exist as specifics. So in the Rebbe's footnote himself, what the Rebbe is saying, that first it seems like Metzias Achas and brings the Teireh. He says, but then in Reish Perek Lamed Gimel, Metzias Bilvad means actually only a Metzias, not as a Chsarn, but as a Maila. So it could be that's what he's referring to here.
When you're calling it a Metzius, this is already it's like a Chad, but it's already, it's not already, this is a Metzius. You're calling it a Metzius, no?
Did you hear what I just explained?
Yeah.
This is Metzius as a Maila, not as a Chsarn. That means it's only a Metzius. It didn't come any shape and form. It's a Metzius of Eses Sfiras Hagnuzis, which means all B'techa Maitzil. So the Rebbe is qualifying his own footnote and saying that maybe Metzias Bilvad actually is correct. But he begins by saying Metzias Achas. So it's only Metzias Bilvad, according to the Pshat that we'll learn soon, means it's not yet specifics. It's only existing. There's an existing oyer, basically. Aval b'madrega habeis, but in the second level, harihem spheres protis. There's specific spheres now. Mashakol achas men yeshlo inyona v'kiyuma haproti. There's specific spheres, each one of them, which that consists of that each one of them has its inyan, means its particular definition or role or function. V'kiyuma haproti, and it's specifically kiyuma would mean it's being sustained in its specific way. In the first level, it's one picture. There's no kiyum proti. There's the mitzias of oyer. Oyer, first level, is encompassed in its source, and it's one body, one entity, like the keyach hatanua hakloli. Here, it's now has developed into, each sphere has its particular role or function, and its particular kiyum means it has to be sustained in that particular way. Chochm is not bina. B'meshehi yesh le'inyana kol achas men yesh le'inyana v'kiyum haprati b'meshehi. Should have added that 2 words. Each one has its particular role and function and kiyum. B'meshehi, relative to what it is. B'meshi, if it's chachma, it's chachma. Bina is bina. In the Eses Sfiras Hagnuzis, there's no need for a particular energy going into chachma or bina, because it's all about that one vision that all the spheres are going to fulfill. Umakol mokim itmer bohu. Nevertheless, on this second level now, itmer means we learn about it, or it's said about it. It's interesting. Eses Sfiras bli ma. So itmer is usually an expression in the Gemara talk about when you bring a source, or not a source, that somebody taught something. So he says, we learn about it, Eses Sfiras bli ma, that's an expression from Sefer Yetzirah. That's why he's used the word itmar. What does he say he says in Sefer Yetzirah, Eses Sfiras bli ma. There are 10 spheres without substance. What means bli ma? Shehem bli mahus adayim. They don't yet have a mahus. What does that mean? That they have a definition, but they don't, and they're not fully developed yet. Think of back to the fetus. It's no longer the one cell, but it's also not yet a viable child either. So you're having the beginnings of a structure, essentially. But you can't call it a mahus adayin. A mahus would be a full-bodied entity. The ima yesem blima. So on one hand, blima, they don't have substance in that sense. That will be in level 3. Nevertheless, they are functioning. They're existing in a kiyum prati, not a kiyum klali. A kiyum prati is specific. In other words, when you look at the stage, let's say middle of the pregnancy, where you already see the beginnings of arms or legs, you can't say there isn't any more an energy. You can't say it's only one energy. You're now seeing there are specifics, but you can't call it a muhus yet. So this middle stage, level 2, is in between. On one hand, it's not yet fully functional gili, which we're going to learn shortly. On the other hand, it's no longer antu chad. It's not chad. It's not yochid. So there's specifics, but they're still not yet fully fleshed out or full dimensional. V'zeu antu chakim v'lei b'chachmi yediyah. So that's the next statement. Antu chad v'lei b'chushbin. You're one and not b'chushbin, meaning not countable. Then there's expression antu chachma, antu chakim rather. You are chakim. You're wise. You emit wisdom. But v'lei b'chachmi yediyah, but not with knowable wisdom. So which one is it? Is it wisdom or not wisdom? So he's explaining this is in between. It's already become now chakim. It's not maven, it's not bina, and it's not chesed. But it's not yet conscious and revealed wisdom. It's like beyond wisdom still, but it's already in the form of chakim. Because it's already in a state of chachma. That's why it's called chakim. But it's not chachma yediyah, meaning knowable or knowledgeable. Chachma, because it doesn't yet have substance in that sense. So, if you think about it in the context of the Esses spheres, hagnuzis, so Esses spheres, hagnuzis, it's altogether you don't have spheres. The whole thing is the vision of the maitzil, of the emanator. In level 2, you have spheres, but they're not of substance. They're not functional yet. But they're the beginning of the shape and form of it. And now, v'amadrega hagimel be'eris, the third level in eris, hein ha'eris hamislapshim b'kelim. This is now the eris that manifest and enclosed in kelim, in containers. Sheboim b'bchinis tfisa v'slapshus mamish b'kelim. They become tfisa, meaning they're contained, and islapshus mamish, because islapshus could also be just passing through, but islapshus mamish means that the eris are nitvas and mislabas, they are now resting, residing, dwelling in the containers in a permanent way. They're not leaving. You have eris and kelim. I'll explain in a minute. Let me just finish reading it. In the kelim, ad shenasim kafimu husa kelim, to the point that they actually get tailored to fit the personality of the containers. Shahu inyan hagilui. This is the inyan of gilui. So you have mitzias, kiyum, and gilui right here. What he began saying, mitzias means if something exists, but that's it. Kiyum is a kiyum prati of the detail. And gilui is now it's revealed, meaning it's fully functional. Okay, so going back to the example of, let's go to Koyach HaTnua, since that's the example here that he used. When you say Kol Chai Misnaneya, that every living thing is movable, you obviously, it doesn't mean it has to be moving. It just means it's created as a movable entity. When you say that you already have a Kloli Prati, and there's some movement of the head, or you're even beginning to move your hand, it's still not that you've moved in writing, or you're carrying something, or you're drawing. And it still doesn't have the details, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, etc. So when you think of it that way, there you see all three stages. There's a place where it doesn't have any shape and form yet. Like he said, he actually said, Mushlo Makola Gilim Shebayim Emenu. It's just the way it is. Chai Misnaneh, something's alive, it moves. That's the way it's created. That's its property. Then there's a movement kloli, but it doesn't have yet details. And then you start writing Aleph, Beis, Gimel. And they all are interdependent, obviously. To give another example, all structures are built this way. I mentioned before, you begin with thought, then you bring it into speech, and then into writing. In the thought, it can be completely submerged in the idea. Like I said, you're completely consumed with a niggin, and you don't even know the details. And then the details begin to emerge, but they're not yet fully defined and expressed. And then there's how it comes into the final level where it's Eidus and Kalim. So to use the example that we learned at length, if you look right in the beginning of Ayin Beis, literally chapter 2 till chapter 45, where he talks about Eidus and Kalim. So he says like this, that Eid and a Keli is not just two different things and they happen to be connecting. The Eid is made to enter this Keli, and the Keli is made to receive this Eid. So the Eid Hariyah, the power to see, and the ayin itself, the physical eye, are made for each other. They're tailored that it should be bislapshus Eid and a Keli. And that same energy goes into the air, you'll not see. Because the air is made, the human air is made for a different type of kayach. So when you talk about kayches pnimim, Eidus and Kalim, you're not just talking about there's an Eir HaChochmeh hovering somewhere. That you could say the neshama has Eir HaChochmeh, Eir HaBina. But once it enters into the body, and I'm using the body as an example for a Keli, Chochmeh resides, Chochmeh Bina Das in the brain, Chesed Gvur Teferes in the heart, and the same thing with all the keiches, each one has their particular role. Let's take an example from electricity. Electricity exists, but until you don't contain it, that it travels into your home, and into each appliance, it's not Eidus and Kalim. There's electricity in the air, you can tap into it, maybe invisible. But when does it become completely functional? When the air is in the Keli, and the Keli is being defined by the Eir, and the Eir is being defined by the Keli. No, as explained at length in volume 1. So what you see here is basically 3 stages, 3 levels of how Eir starts off all the way in the level of Yachid, Chad, B'lei B'chushban, then begins after the Tzimtzum to develop some shape and form, which is of a Chakim B'lei B'chach, but still Ma, B'li Ma. And then finally it gets a Ma, it gets a Muhus in the Kalim. And these 3 are called Mitzias, Kiyum, and Gili. So he concluded what we began in the beginning of this chapter, that there are 3 levels in it. Now, we'll stop here, obviously, end of chapter 32. Still obviously needs to be explained what this will help us understand the 3 levels of Bitl in Eir. That's what we're still going to learn. So we'll stop here.